Right now, as you watch this video, there is a planet 140 million miles away that could become humanity's second home, and yet today it would kill you in less than 2 minutes if you stepped outside without a suit. No air to breathe, no liquid water on the surface, radiation pouring down from a sky with no shield. And still, scientists, engineers, and dreamers around the world are seriously asking the same question. Could we turn Mars into a living, breathing, green world? Not in science fiction, not in a movie. In reality, using science we already understand and technology we are already building. Today we are going to walk through exactly how terraforming Mars would work, step by step, from the freezing red desert it is now to the possible blue and green planet it could become. Stay with me until the end, because the final stage of this transformation is something that sounds almost impossible, and yet it is being studied seriously by real scientists at real space agencies. Let's start with the planet as it actually is today. Mars is often called Earth's twin, and in some ways that is true. A Martian day is only about 40 minutes longer than ours. Mars has seasons because its axis is tilted almost the same amount as Earth's. It has polar ice caps, canyons, dust storms, and even evidence of ancient rivers and lakes. But that is where the similarities end and the harsh reality begins. The Martian atmosphere is less than 1% as thick as Earth's. It is made almost entirely of carbon dioxide, with barely any oxygen. The average temperature is far below freezing, and the planet has almost no protective magnetic field, which means it is constantly bombarded by radiation from the sun and from deep space. If humans want to live there long term, and I mean really live, not just survive in a tin can, something fundamental about Mars has to change. This idea is not new. Scientists have been seriously discussing terraforming Mars since the 1970s, when planetary scientists first started calculating what it would take to thicken the atmosphere and warm the surface. Carl Sagan himself wrote about the concept, suggesting that Mars might have once had a much thicker atmosphere and could theoretically get one again. Since then, the idea has grown from a thought experiment into a genuine field of study, with papers published on greenhouse warming, magnetic shielding, and even engineered biology that could survive on the Martian surface today. So what exactly needs to happen to turn Mars into a livable green world? There are really 4 major transformations that would need to occur, and they would likely happen in overlapping stages over a very long period of time. First, the planet needs a way to trap heat and hold an atmosphere. Second, it needs protection from radiation. Third, it needs liquid water on the surface. And fourth, it needs living things, starting with the simplest organisms and eventually working up to plants that can survive in open Martian air. Let's go through each of these one at a time, because the details are genuinely fascinating. The first challenge is warming the planet. Right now, Mars is cold enough that carbon dioxide itself sometimes freezes onto the poles as dry ice. To make Mars warmer, we need more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, gases that trap heat from the sun the same way carbon dioxide and methane do here on Earth. One of the most discussed methods involves releasing the carbon dioxide that is already frozen into the Martian polar caps and locked into the soil. If you could vaporize enough of that frozen carbon dioxide, the atmosphere would thicken and a natural greenhouse effect would begin, warming the surface further and releasing even more gas in a self-reinforcing cycle. Researchers from NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory studied this exact idea and found that there might not be enough accessible carbon dioxide on Mars to thicken the atmosphere to Earth-like pressure. But there is likely enough to raise the temperature meaningfully and start the process moving in the right direction, especially if combined with other techniques. One of the boldest ideas for warming Mars involves giant mirrors in space. Imagine enormous reflective sheets, kilometers wide, made of lightweight material like mylar, positioned in orbit around Mars or at a stable point between Mars and the Sun. These mirrors would focus additional sunlight onto the polar ice caps, melting them faster than natural sunlight ever could. This concept was proposed by a research team as early as the 1990s and has been revisited many times since, because unlike some other ideas, it does not require importing any new material to Mars. It simply uses sunlight that is already there and concentrates it. Then there is a more controversial idea, one that made headlines a few years ago when a well-known entrepreneur suggested it publicly: detonating nuclear devices above the Martian poles to instantly vaporize the frozen carbon dioxide and water ice. The appeal is speed. Instead of decades of gradual warming, you get an immediate release of greenhouse gas. But most planetary scientists have pushed back hard on this idea, for good reason. The total amount of vaporized gas would likely be small compared to what is needed. The radioactive fallout could create serious contamination, and the shockwave and dust thrown into the thin atmosphere could actually block sunlight for a period rather than help. It is a dramatic idea, but the scientific consensus is that gradual, engineered methods would be safer and ultimately more effective. A more realistic and increasingly discussed option involves manufacturing greenhouse gases directly on Mars using materials already present in the Martian soil and atmosphere. Certain synthetic gases, sometimes called super greenhouse gases, are far more effective at trapping heat than carbon dioxide, in some cases thousands of times more powerful. Robotic factories could be built on the Martian surface to continuously produce these gases from local resources and release them into the atmosphere. Over decades, this could raise the average temperature enough to allow water to exist as a liquid, at least in low-lying regions and during certain seasons. Now let's talk about the second major challenge, and honestly this might be the hardest one of all. Mars lost its global magnetic field billions of years ago. Scientists believe that early in its history, Mars had a molten iron core generating a protective magnetic field very similar to Earth's, but that core cooled down and the dynamo effect shut off. Without that magnetic field, the solar wind has been slowly stripping away the Martian atmosphere for eons, which is a huge part of why Mars is so thin and cold today. Data from NASA's MAVEN spacecraft confirmed this process is still happening right now, with the solar wind peeling away atmospheric particles into space continuously. So even if we manage to thicken the Martian atmosphere without some form of protection, the sun would slowly strip it away again over thousands or millions of years. This is where one of the most elegant proposed solutions comes in. Scientists have suggested placing a large magnetic shield generator at a stable gravitational point between Mars and the Sun, known as the Mars L1 Lagrange point. This artificial magnetosphere would not need to cover the entire planet directly. Instead, it would deflect the solar wind before it even reaches Mars, essentially creating an artificial magnetic umbrella that shields the whole planet from behind. NASA scientists presented this concept at a planetary science conference, and while it remains theoretical, the physics behind it is sound. It would not restore Mars's original magnetic field, but it could stop the ongoing atmospheric loss and allow whatever atmosphere we build up to actually stay in place. Now, even with warming and shielding underway, we still need liquid water, and this is where Mars actually has some good news. Mars is not a dry planet in the way many people imagine. There is a significant amount of water ice locked into the polar caps and buried under the surface. And in 2018, radar data revealed evidence of what appeared to be a lake of liquid water beneath the southern ice cap, kept liquid by pressure and possibly dissolved salts. As the atmosphere thickens and temperatures rise, some of this ice would begin to melt. Combined with atmospheric pressure high enough to keep water from instantly boiling away, this could eventually create flowing rivers, lakes, and possibly even small seas in low-lying basins like the Hellas or Argyre impact craters, which are some of the lowest points on the entire planet and would naturally collect water first. This brings us to the fourth and final major stage, and honestly the most awe-inspiring one: life. Even a warmer, wetter, shielded Mars is still not a green planet until something is actually growing there. This is where the science shifts from planetary engineering into biology, and some remarkable candidates already exist right here on Earth. Extremophiles, organisms that survive in the harshest environments on our own planet, are the leading candidates for the first life on Mars. Certain cyanobacteria and lichens have already been tested in simulated Martian conditions in laboratories, and some have survived exposure to Mars-like pressure, temperature, and radiation for extended periods. The European Space Agency's BIOMEX experiment placed lichens and bacteria on the outside of the International Space Station, directly exposed to the vacuum of space and solar radiation, and found that several species survived. The idea is to start small. Genetically hardy cyanobacteria and algae, potentially engineered further to be even more radiation resistant, could be introduced into sheltered, warmer regions of Mars first, perhaps inside craters, lava tubes, or greenhouse domes with only partial protection from the environment. These pioneer organisms would begin doing something Mars has not experienced in billions of years: photosynthesis. Slowly converting carbon dioxide into oxygen and building up organic material in the soil. This process would take an extraordinarily long time on a planetary scale, likely many centuries just to meaningfully shift the atmospheric oxygen content. But it is the foundational step that everything else depends on. As oxygen levels slowly rise and temperatures stabilize, the next step would involve introducing increasingly complex plant life. Mosses and lichens first, since they can survive in poor soil with minimal nutrients. Then hardy grasses and shrubs bred or engineered for cold tolerance and low oxygen requirements. Scientists have already experimented with growing certain plants in Mars simulant soil made from volcanic material that mimics the mineral composition of the Martian regolith. And results have shown that, with the right nutrients added, some crops can actually grow, though the native soil alone is not fertile enough on its own due to toxic perchlorate compounds that would need to be broken down or removed first. Over time, and we are talking about a timescale of centuries to possibly 1,000 years or more, the vision becomes clearer. Forests could theoretically establish themselves in warmer equatorial regions. Rivers could flow seasonally from melting ice. The sky, currently a pale butterscotch color due to dust particles, might eventually take on a different hue as atmospheric composition changes. Some models suggest a partially terraformed Mars, even without a full Earth-like atmosphere, could allow humans to walk outside with only an oxygen mask and a warm jacket rather than a full pressurized spacesuit, which would be an absolutely staggering milestone in human history. Now, it is important to be honest about the scale of this challenge, because there is a lot of understandable excitement around terraforming, but the science demands realism. Every serious study on this subject agrees on one thing: this is not a project that happens in decades. It is a project that would unfold across centuries, and in some models, over 1,000 years or more, requiring sustained effort across generations of humans who may never personally see a green Mars in their lifetime. The amount of energy needed to run atmospheric processors, magnetic shield generators, and greenhouse gas factories continuously for centuries would require power sources far beyond what we currently have readily available on Mars, likely meaning advanced nuclear fission or fusion reactors operating around the clock. There are also serious ethical questions that scientists and philosophers are actively debating right now. If Mars has any native microbial life of its own, even simple life, buried deep underground, do we have the right to fundamentally alter its environment before we even understand what already exists there? This question is taken so seriously that NASA and other space agencies follow strict planetary protection protocols specifically to avoid contaminating Mars with Earth organisms until we can properly search for native life first. Some scientists argue that if we ever do find native Martian life, terraforming plans might need to be paused entirely, or at minimum radically redesigned to protect that life rather than replace it. There is also the question of whether partial terraforming might actually be more realistic and more achievable than full terraforming. Instead of trying to make the entire planet Earth-like, some researchers propose creating large domed regions or sealed valleys where a livable atmosphere and ecosystem is contained and maintained artificially, essentially creating green oases on a still mostly red planet. This approach could deliver meaningful results within decades rather than centuries, and many scientists see it as the most likely first real step toward a greener Mars, long before anyone attempts to transform the entire globe. So where does this leave us today, in the year 2026? Right now, missions are focused on the earlier steps that any terraforming project would depend on: testing how plants grow in Martian soil simulant, studying radiation-shielding materials, mapping underground ice deposits that would be essential water sources, and planning the crewed missions that would eventually put the first human boots back on another planet since the moon landings. Missions that space agencies and private companies alike are actively working toward within the coming decades. Every piece of data gathered by rovers like Perseverance and Curiosity, every discovery about subsurface water, every experiment testing extremophile survival, is a small piece of a much larger puzzle that scientists have been assembling since Carl Sagan first raised the question generations ago. Terraforming Mars is not science fiction anymore. It is a real field of serious scientific study, built on real physics, real chemistry, and real biology, even though the technology to fully execute it does not exist yet, and the timeline stretches far beyond any single human lifetime. But that is exactly what makes this story so remarkable. We are potentially living in the earliest chapters of a story that could take our descendants centuries to finish. The story of humanity turning a cold, dead, red desert into a second living world. Whether that green Mars ever truly arrives depends on choices, investments, and discoveries that are happening right now, in our own time. If this journey through the science of terraforming Mars fascinated you, make sure you subscribe for more deep dives into the science of space, the planets, and the future of humanity beyond Earth. Let me know in the comments which stage of this transformation you find the most fascinating, whether it is the giant space mirrors, the artificial magnetic shield, or the idea of the first plants ever to grow under a Martian sky. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.